Tetsuya Takahashi began his career at Nihon Falcom in the late 1980s working on games like Star Trader and Dinosaur as an artist and graphic designer. He also worked on games in bigger series like Ys 3 and Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes, which was the first game in Nihon Falcom's long-running Legend of Heroes games that continue to this day as the Trails series. In the 90s, he left Nihon Falcom for SquareSoft, where he began working on literally every JRPG except Dragon Quest and Shin Megami Tensei that really mattered in the 90s in some capacity as a graphic designer. He started as a debugger on Final Fantasy III before working on battle graphics for Final Fantasy IV, field map graphics for Romancing Saga, field graphics for Final Fantasy V, and he also worked as a graphics director in Final Fantasy VI. That awesome mech cutscene at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI was his work and a glimpse into his mecha vision for future JRPGs. But before his game directorial debut, he also did graphic designs for another mecha RPG, Front Mission. He was also a graphics director for another game nobody has ever heard of called Chrono Trigger. Up to this point, Tetsuya Takahashi's resume literally couldn't have been any better as a developer, but while everyone had heard of developers like Yuji Horii, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and even Akitoshi Kawazu for their creative leadership on projects like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and the Saga series, nobody knew who Tetsuya Takahashi was, yet. And that was about to change. SquareSoft was hard at work on their next huge RPG leading up to 1997. This ambitious game was a multi-disc release using new graphics technology, being worked on by the company's best talent. Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife, under the pen name Soraya Saga, submitted a pitch for the story to this new game, and when it launched as Final Fantasy VII, it turned Final Fantasy into a worldwide blockbuster. Except, SquareSoft didn't use Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga's proposal for Final Fantasy VII. SquareSoft was obviously interested in what they were cooking, but the subject matter for their script was deemed too dark and complicated for a fantasy. SquareSoft allowed him to work on his game, but first as a sequel to Chrono Trigger. Already an incredible honor considering the popularity of that game. But would such a dark and complicated script work for a Chrono Trigger sequel? The world will never know, because Tetsuya Takahashi was frustrated with Final Fantasy, and there was no way the script would have worked for Chrono Trigger. Ultimately, Tetsuya Takahashi got to create a brand new turn-based JRPG intellectual property for SquareSoft. His development team was composed largely of inexperienced developers compared to who was working on Final Fantasy, but what his team lacked in experience, they made up for in raw passion and talent. And not everybody was inexperienced. They had Yasunori Mitsuda, whose work on Chrono Trigger in 1996 turned him into an instant celebrity in the JRPG music world, to do the game's soundtrack. Kunihiko Tanaka, another veteran from Nihon Falcom who worked with Tetsuya Takahashi on Wanderers from Ys 3, added his talents as a manga and video game artist towards designing the characters for this new game. And they managed to get the mechanical designer for the Gundam series to design the game's mechs, known in the world of the game as Gears. This game eventually released as Xenogears. Xenogears' twist on the turn-based battle system had two variants. In human combat, players would input sequences of actions costing action points to execute sequenced combos for each of the 9 playable characters. Players could also spend ether points to use ally abilities for offense and ally support. In gear combat, fuel is expelled instead of action points, and attack levels would build up as mechs attacked in combat. Each attack level up to 3 opened up a new death blow. Achieving the 4th level, known as Infinity Mode, had its own set of death blows and an infinity attack. Infinity Mode powered up mech actions as well. Players had the option of boosting to act faster in combat at the expense of greater fuel consumption. Ether abilities also had magnified power while fighting in gears. Unlike every other JRPG SquareSoft made up to that point, anime and pre-rendered CGI movie clips created by Production IG were used to illustrate important plot points within the game. You can even see this showed off during the game's opening scenes. Now, mecha, science fiction, and anime weren't news to JRPGs, even if anime cutscenes and science fiction were fresh takes for what people expected from Square Enix JRPGs at the time. The secret sauce of Xenogears lied in its extraordinarily profound and violent story. Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife had an incredible script and a vision for a JRPG unlike anything else on the market at the time. Even the 4 discs this game released on for the PlayStation wasn't enough to realize their vision for the series. While I was, and still am to this day, accustomed to playing JRPGs with stories that have mostly shallow characters for self-inserts with cliché do-gooder protagonists emphasizing the power of teamwork and friendship, Xenogears was completely different. How different? The story of Xenogears incorporates Jungian psychology, Freudian thought, and most controversially for the 90s in the West, religious symbolism. The game almost wasn't localized in the West for its depictions of religious symbolism. There are a lot of twisted things in this game. Blood, slaughter, metempsychosis, politics, and child abuse. Gaius. There's a long history spanning thousands of years and events that take place in interstellar settings long before the events on the game's planet, too. Xenogears' themes and stories are also hauntingly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche and two dystopian films, THX 1138, George Lucas's directorial film, and the film Soylent Green, which is probably the source of one of the game's biggest, most disgusting secrets. The final boss of the game's name had to be changed due to the religious outcry it could have caused in the West, a situation somewhat similar to a certain Megami Tensei game I will not name. Even the most cliched and overused plot point in JRPGs, the main character Faye's amnesia, has an incredible amount of dark layers behind it that hide a lot of Xenogears' wow moments when it comes to the story's execution. In fact, just about every character in this game is not who they seem. From superpowered human characters that can wreck huge gears with their bare hands, to rebirths of figures that would equate to biblical equivalents in modern religions. This story had so many complex scientific, philosophical, psychological, and religious references in it that several Western localizers refused to translate the game before it eventually became the first major project of translator Richard Honeywood at Square. Yasunori Mitsuda's soundtrack for this game is also incredible. In addition to those incredible ambient alien tracks that capture the emotion of Xenogears' most serious moments, it features a lot of themes influenced by Celtic and Irish music. The Xenogears soundtrack was also Square's first game to feature a vocal track in its credits roll at the end of the game. This soundtrack has been remastered and rearranged multiple times over the years. Now, if I or any other Westerner had played a flagship Megami Tensei JRPG before Xenogears in 1998, maybe this game wouldn't have been as shocking when it was released. The game did somehow manage to release with a teen ESRB rating despite depictions of violence and some pretty shocking story elements. Of course, I was 16 years old when I played this game, and the most shocking thing I watched up to this point was the original Neon Genesis Evangelion anime. In fact, I consider Xenogears to be the Neon Genesis Evangelion of JRPGs, and both pieces of media dealt with the mental breakdowns and psychological elements. Both creations even shared troubles in their respective productions that inhibited their ability to meet the ambitions of their creators. For Xenogears, this led to much of the game's amazing script being shoehorned into a hot mess of cutscenes after the second disc, with a few disjointed sections of gameplay which sort of ruined the pacing of the gameplay. Although this was popularly believed to be due to budget, it was actually the unfortunate consequence of having too many inexperienced developers working on the game. Xenogears had so much going on because it was actually set as the 5th game in an ambitiously planned 6-game series. We never did see all 6 games in the Xenogears universe, but a Japanese-only book called Xenogears Perfect Works details the history of the universe, and there are fan translations of the book floating around if you know where to look. Despite these issues, Xenogears made an extraordinarily huge splash among its freshly carved niche when it released in 1998, especially for brand new IP in an increasingly competitive turn-based JRPG genre. Just like Tetsuya Takahashi was getting frustrated with Final Fantasy, there were plenty of people hungry for a fresh take on the JRPG genre in the West. The game sold 1.19 million copies in Japan and 230,000 copies in the West. And I'm proud to be one of the 230,000 people who got that game on launch and played it, because while the game hasn't aged too well with its level design and gameplay, the story to the game will always be pretty incredible. Basically, while the mainstream was playing Final Fantasy, the hardcore JRPG niche was talking about Xenogears. And the game had everything I love in a JRPG: playable mechs, science fiction, anime, loads of crazy drama, dystopia, political conspiracies, and a pretty fun battle system. I think the level design, especially in the sewers, can drag on a little too long, ruining the pacing a bit though. And I do agree with people who say the latter part of the game's cacophony of cutscenes ruins the pacing too. Even if the execution of the story was flawed, its greatness is still there. In fact, if I were to make a top list, just judging the best stories in all video games and not just JRPGs, Xenogears' story would still be near, if not at the top for me. As for how I think the game compares to the JRPGs of today, well, the story is still better than just about every JRPG I've ever played, including Tetsuya Takahashi's own Xenoblade Chronicles games, that still have well-told stories but are tamer and more palatable to younger audiences. I think Xenogears' turn-based gameplay holds up well too, but as level design that means you're in a dungeon for a really long time, the frequency of random encounters, and the game's extraordinary length caused by these unfavorable things would probably make it difficult to play for all but the most hardcore of Tetsuya Takahashi fans today. The unveiling of the game's incredible story is a great reward for your patience though. Still, it would be hard for me to recommend the game to people today. It needs a fat, stinky quadruple A budget remake involving Nintendo, Tetsuya Takahashi and Square Enix for it to realize its full potential and update to a level today's gamers would enjoy more. Given how popular anime has gotten lately and how popular Tetsuya Takahashi and Monolith Soft have gotten, I do think if they made it happen, it would have the potential to sell like gangbusters. Anyways, Xenogears also had several Japanese books and comics published around it. Xenogears God-Slaying Story by Masatoshi Kusakabe, Xenogears Perfect Works, which I already mentioned, and Thousands of Daggers, which contains the entire Japanese script of the game with screenshots. 2 manga books, Xenogears Comic Anthology and Xenogears Yonkoma Comic, were also released. There are also Xenogears wall scrolls, notebooks, pins, keychains, and postcards with the cast of the game on them. After Xenogears, there was a little bit of drama at SquareSoft, ultimately leading to Tetsuya Takahashi and some people he worked with who were passionate about Xenogears forming their own company, Monolith Soft, and developing games for Namco. To put it simply, SquareSoft was more interested in putting money towards Final Fantasy Spirits Within than investing in another Xenogears game. If you weren't alive during this time, Spirits Within ended up being a huge turd. I remember watching it in theater and was thoroughly disappointed. Anyways, Monolith Soft's first game for Namco was Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Wille zur Macht. My German sucks, but I think it translates to A Will to Power. A game that was, on paper, completely unrelated to Xenogears, but it definitely was designed around attracting fans of Xenogears and had similar narrative influences. Xenosaga Episode 1 was a turn-based JRPG with 3 controllable characters in battle. Players could see enemies before encountering them. Battles involved either fighting on foot or in mechs. Mechs would carry over their damage between battles. Players would use action points for actions in combat, and ether points were back for special support actions. Items, ranged attacks, melee attacks, and guarding actions could be used in battle too. The combat system had some similarities to Xenogears. The game definitely had a lot of fans of Xenogears come back to purchase the game, myself included. It sold over 1 million copies worldwide as of July 2003. Not quite as well as Xenogears, but still not bad at all considering it was selling under a new brand name as new IP with Namco. This game was developed for the PlayStation 2, so Monolith Soft was able to incorporate 3D graphics, but again, the game was limited by the experience levels of its developers. 20 people who worked on Xenogears followed Tetsuya Takahashi to Monolith Soft, but the rest of the 100 developers were brought in later. Yasunori Mitsuda was also back on board for the soundtrack. Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife Soraya Saga wrote the script for the game, and like Xenogears, Xenosaga was planned to be an ambitious 6-part series. Monolith Soft completed development of JRPG Baten Kaitos for the GameCube in 2003 before releasing their next Xeno game, Xenosaga Freaks, in 2004. Xenosaga Freaks is a Japanese exclusive adventure and puzzle game with 7 playable characters. The game was more laid back and fun compared to the serious themes represented in Tetsuya Takahashi's Xeno games. Xenosaga Freaks consists of 4 parts. One is Xenokomi, which plays like an illustrated text adventure. Kotoba no Puzzle, Xenopitan is a Xenosaga-themed version of Namco's Kotoba no Puzzle, Moji Pitan. Something like a Scrabble word puzzle as far as I can tell. The third part is simply an encyclopedia of Xenosaga Episode 1 terms, and the last part is a demo for Xenosaga Episode 2. While the game was never released in the West, 5 of the 7 Xenokomi chapters have been fan-translated. Also in 2004, Monolith Soft released Xenosaga Episode 2, Jensetsu van Gut und Böse, which translates to Beyond Good and Evil. Xenosaga 2 evolved the battle system a bit, adding boost options for characters that store a lot of action points. Characters had 3 levels of attacks, and enemies were weak to particular sequences of attacks. Enemies could be knocked out, and then players could perform special attacks on them. Mech combat also returned, and this time sub-pilots could be assigned to the mechs to alter the attack options. New items and accessories could only be gathered from defeating enemies and exploring the environments. Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga wrote the script, but the game was directed by other staff members, with Takahashi taking an executive producer role on the game. Ambitions for the series were scaled back to accommodate 3 games at this time, with ideas for more if the series took off after the 3rd game. Yasunori Mitsuda had creative clashes with Namco and was busy, so he didn't return for the soundtrack. Xenosaga Episode 2 was a commercial failure, selling only 50% of its projected sales numbers, but the only sales number I could find was 250,000 sales in Japan as of February 2005. On mobile in 2004, Monolith Soft also released Xenosaga Pied Piper. This game was an RPG spin-off of the Xenosaga trilogy, following the story of the human life of Ziggurat 8 from the trilogy and events taking place 100 years before the first Xenosaga game. The title was a reference to the German story of the Pied Piper of Hameln. This game is also exclusive to Japan. After Pied Piper, Monolith Soft worked on Namco x Capcom and Baten Kaitos Origins. They also released Xenosaga 1 and 2 together for the Nintendo DS exclusively in Japan in 2006. Several changes were made for this version of the Xenosaga games. Battles were now random, and with 2 screens on the DS, the UI was separated from the gameplay screen on top, which also played all of the game's movies. The game only sold 36,500 copies in Japan, which was considered very disappointing for a series that was still popular in Japan. Monolith Soft also released Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra, in 2006, finishing the story to Xenosaga. The subtitle is translated Thus Spoke or Thus Spake Zarathustra. The game was released in Japan and North America, but not Europe. Players could place traps in the field to immobilize enemies, and engaging with them while immobilized would give the player's party a boost. Players could attack, perform arts, or consume ether points to use special abilities. Players and enemies had break gauges, which would leave them vulnerable if depleted. Mechs were back and could now enter a special anima mode to boost attack power and lower energy costs for actions. This game sold 343,000 copies across Japan, mainland Asia, and North America. I'll be 100% honest and just say I never even completed Xenosaga Episode 1. I grew bored of the gameplay and the story didn't capture me in the same way Xenogears' story did. Less because the story was bad and more because I think it was poorly presented within the context of the game. I didn't like the minigames and I wasn't too crazy about how Xenosaga did its turn-based combat either. I wanted a world map like Xenogears had too. In fact, the only thing I liked about the game was the character design of Cosmos. And because I never completed the first game, I also didn't buy and play Xenosaga Episode 2 or 3, nor go out of my way to play the Japanese releases like I normally would do if I really liked what I was playing. A good friend of mine who did play those games told me that the series got better, so maybe if the series gets a proper remake involving Tetsuya Takahashi, which is extremely unlikely, I'd be interested in actually giving the Xenosaga series another shot. Otherwise, they aren't games I feel like I ever need to go back to, nor are they games I'd recommend to anybody except bigger fans of Tetsuya Takahashi than I am. And Namco probably feels the same way, which is why they aren't doing anything with the series. I think a good series to compare Xenosaga to is the Trails in the Sky series, another series with ambitions to continue a long story across multiple games. Except Trails has much more accessible traditional turn-based JRPG gameplay, and was able to pick up momentum for a brand new Legend of Heroes series for Falcom, with the good word of mouth from its passionate fans. Even the Trails series resets in a new place on the continent every 3 or 4 games to give new players a chance to jump into the series too, which helps. In contrast though, Xenosaga Episode 1 was already filtering out its passionate Xenogears niche further with new turn-based gameplay mechanics, and a setting that didn't have the fun world map Xenogears had. I just didn't jive with the changes the game made compared to Xenogears, so I never finished the game, and like a lot of what happens to any game series where you need to play the previous game to understand the next after the first game, the second game didn't sell as well as the first because it's already filtered further by people who completed that first game and enjoyed it enough to be interested in the second one. Judging from how Xenosaga 2 sold disappointingly after Xenosaga 1, I think this is why the game didn't meet Namco's expectations. Anyways, after the poor performance of Xenosaga Episode 3, Monolith Soft was understandably suffering from poor morale. Bandai Namco couldn't justify spending more resources on a new Xenosaga game. So until 2010, Monolith Soft developed a lot of other games unrelated to Xenosaga, and in fact, their games were being published by Nintendo as much as they were being published by Namco Bandai. Monolith Soft had developed a very favorable relationship with Nintendo, and Tetsuya Takahashi never gave up on his dreams, but he had to start over. From 2006 to 2010, he was working on another very special, much bigger project with Nintendo. He moved away from the old-fashioned narrative and design techniques used for developing Xenosaga. Tetsuya Takahashi was inspired by the concept of people living on the bodies of gigantic gods. A 3D model of the idea was created with materials, and Tetsuya Takahashi combined this concept with an unrelated idea for a story to this game. His goal was to improve the morale of his team. The game was pitched to Nintendo, and development began in 2006. Nintendo said the story should be designed for a wide audience, with a romanticist approach. The game's original title, Monado, Beginning of the World, was to be completely unrelated to the Xeno games, but Satoru Iwata, legend that he is, had the name changed to Xenoblade Chronicles to honor Tetsuya Takahashi's previous titles and his dedication to the new game. The game's systems were designed around the mechanic of the main character being able to see the future. A turn-based combat system was tested, but didn't work for this, so the team went with a more active MMORPG-style combat system for the game. Player-controlled party members could use arts with a cooldown time. In addition to foregoing turn-based combat, it was also decided not to transition to a separate battle arena for combat in order to create a more immersive experience. The game's fields were huge open zones, giving it the immense scope of an open-world game in which players would be rewarded for exploring the fields. The game had a deep affinity system where players could develop the relationships between characters in their party through heart-to-heart events. Side quests would also develop the relationship among the inhabitants of the numerous settlements in the game. Nintendo provided some very talented staff to help Monolith Soft with developing the game for the Wii, particularly for system-related issues and the scenario. Music was composed by Manami Kiyota, Ace Plus, and Yoko Shimomura, with Yasunori Mitsuda composing the game's most important track, the ending theme, Beyond the Sky. In 2010, Xenoblade Chronicles released in Japan on the Wii. The game released a year later in Europe and Australia. The game actually almost never released in North America. It wasn't until 2012, after a fan campaign called Operation Rainfall spearheaded demand for Xenoblade Chronicles and some other games that weren't coming west, that Nintendo finally got its thumbs out from its butt to give the game a way too limited release in North America through Nintendo's store and GameStop. Xenoblade Chronicles was a critical success, being Tetsuya Takahashi's first game since Xenogears to score so many 9+ out of 10 review scores. The sales numbers for the game were difficult to track due to its unusual retail circumstances, but the game's definitive edition remake on the Nintendo Switch sold 1.52 million units. And if the popularity of Chugga Conroy's legendary Xenoblade Chronicles LP is any indication, the original game was extraordinarily popular in the West. The game also has a ton of memes floating around on the internet. I'll talk a little more about how I felt about Xenoblade Chronicles later, but I will say I was grateful that even though the game didn't have a world map like Xenogears did, the open zones were so huge that didn't matter. This definitely contributed to my change of heart on this game versus my feelings towards Xenosaga Episode 1. Tetsuya Takahashi was already taking the lessons he learned from the development of Xenoblade Chronicles to work on a spiritual successor to Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii U called Xenoblade Chronicles Cross. This game released in 2015. But before that, Nintendo released Xenoblade Chronicles 3D on the new 3DS in 2015, which was just a 3DS port of the original Xenoblade Chronicles to the new 3DS. Anyways, Xenoblade Chronicles Cross was a departure from Tetsuya Takahashi's usual narrative-driven games, as it was more like a sandbox where only a very small percentage of the events made up the game's main story. In fact, the story could be cleared in 10 to 20 hours depending on how distracted by side quests you want it to be. Furthermore, there was no requirement to have played Xenoblade Chronicles 1 to enjoy the game or its story. Instead, the game was loaded with world-building side quests, smaller side quests to help build the strength of characters, and loads of powerful indigenous tyrants to challenge players beyond what the story offered. Most importantly, in my opinion though, playable highly customizable mechs called skulls were in the game, which made me cry manly Xenogears tears. The game did inherit its MMO-style combat from Xenoblade Chronicles, with a few key differences. There was no healer class in the game, with healing instead taking place when players respond positively to ally requests to perform certain types of actions in battle. Quick-time events taking place during battle could also result in buffs to the party if successfully done. Skull combat inherits a lot of the same features as on-foot combat, but your skulls could be destroyed if you weren't careful. There were numerous NPCs that could join the player's party, and players could learn powerful arts from NPCs. Players could also hire copies of other human players through the game's connected multiplayer to serve as powerful AI-controlled members of the party. And players could also participate in squads of up to 32 other human players to accomplish goals that would reward players or even do quests together in brief instances. One other important aspect of the on-foot combat was that the equipped weapons determined the character's class and their art loadout. Since the character could equip a melee and ranged weapon, there were actually multiple combinations of weapons that made players better at doing some things than others, like burst damage, status ailments and buffs, and staying in heightened battle states. This actually gave the game a lot of replayability for players like me who loved beating the game over and over again with different weapon types. All of this rich gameplay was put into a proper open world that wrapped around like a planet instead of an open zone. It would take a really long time, but a player could walk and swim all the way to the other side of the world from the game's hub right from near the beginning of the game. Players could choose how they wanted to gain most of their experience through the game's role system. For example, Harriers would hunt tyrants, or Pathfinders would discover checkpoints. Tetsuya Takahashi reached out to Hiroyuki Sawano for a completely different sound for Xenoblade Chronicles Cross compared to Xenoblade Chronicles. Sawano composed some amazing anime soundtracks for Attack on Titan, Kill la Kill, and a lot of other Japanese shows. In fact, I'd be shocked if anybody who's watched anime over the past few years hasn't heard of him by now. His soundtrack for Xenoblade Chronicles Cross is extraordinarily fresh. If this soundtrack has weaknesses, it's that you'll miss the best part of most of his songs, either because the cutscenes don't last long enough to hear everything, or you'll finish the battles long before the songs get to the good parts. Xenoblade Xenoblade Chronicles Cross was a big beefy boy of a game for the Wii U, and I remember picking up an external hard drive just to load game data onto it to help the game load its world as I played. The game was worth every penny, as I ended up putting over 700 hours into it over a period of several years in pursuit of perfecting mech builds and trying out new weapons and story replays. The game's sales numbers were good for a Wii U game, but the Wii U itself didn't have a large market share of video game players, so the game didn't achieve the kind of sales it could have. The game sold 114,600 units in Japan by the end of 2015. The game sold double that in the West and got a lot of positive press. In my opinion, it's the best game on the Wii U. Monolith Soft used the foundation they built from Xenoblade Chronicles Cross to speed up the development of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, a thematic sequel to Xenoblade Chronicles, which was released worldwide on December 1st, 2017. While there is a relationship between Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the game wasn't marketed as a sequel, nor did it show off any relationship between it and the first game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was a callback to focusing on story over gameplay. Its combat system maintained the MMO style, with selecting actions that would recharge. But actions in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 recharged after characters landed enough successful attacks against enemies. The unique blade system defined Xenoblade Chronicles 2's combat. Players controlled a party of 3 drivers that could have up to 3 blades equipped at a time. Blades were like mostly humanoid summons that had elementals and could confer unique bonuses in battle. While every character had at least 1 blade as part of the story, the game's gacha system was used to fill out a driver's pool of blades to proceed through the game. In addition to the powerful unique blades, there were some really strong normal blades too. There was also a minigame and quest to develop a special artificial blade throughout the game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 also leveled up blades through an affinity system full of mini quests to do to unlock bonuses that would strengthen blades. Some of the unlocks from these affinity quests were extremely powerful for people who built their party around taking advantage of them. Just like Xenoblade Chronicles and Chronicles Cross, the game was loaded with powerful monsters to conquer and huge landmasses to explore. Yasunori Mitsuda was in charge of the game's music, but Ace was back to continue the great work they did on the first Xenoblade Chronicles. Mitsuda assigned the musicians to roles similar to what they had for the first Xenoblade in order to not ruin the image set by that game with its amazing soundtrack. I love the art direction for this game. Masatsugu Saito, whose legendary artwork on the anime science fiction film Expelled from Paradise must have served as some inspiration for Mithra's design, was put in charge of character design for Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Seriously, Expelled from Paradise is, artistically, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 before Xenoblade Chronicles 2 existed. Anyways, although he was designing characters for a video game for the first time, I think he did an awesome job bringing the advantages of anime aesthetics to the Xenoblade universe. He designed most of the game's main characters. In addition, a small army of incredible artists famous in the anime, manga, and game world in Japan were contracted to create the blades, giving the game a very refreshing collection of eclectic designs for the blades. If you've been in touch with the Japanese anime industry over the past few decades, then you would most certainly recognize some of the blade designs in this game. Tetsuya Nomura of Final Fantasy VII and Kingdom Hearts fame designed the characters in the game's Torna organization. Even Soraya Saga designed a blade for this game. Certain characters from past Xeno games were also designed to be blades in this game too. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was a huge game if you were like me and you just had to see every heart-to-heart and develop all the unique blades affinities to max. I streamed the game on release day for like a few months for 320 hours to do everything, and then many months later to do all the new things that came with the game's season pass, including its standalone DLC, Torn of the Golden Country. Needless to say, this game was one of the best JRPGs of the Switch generation for me, and I'll elaborate more on that later. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 sold nearly 200,000 units in Japan in just a month since its release. As of December 2022, the game has sold 2.44 million units, making it Monolith Soft's best-selling title ever, despite many reviewers' complaints of poor performance and its lower review scores compared to the other Xenoblade Chronicles games. Although I love the game, I have to admit the game would really benefit from a remaster on the Switch too. I think the high sales numbers were mostly due to the Switch's incredible momentum during its launch year, and the fact that it was clear you didn't need to have played prior games in the series to enjoy it. Speaking of remasters, Monolith Soft released a remaster of the original Xenoblade Chronicles in 2020 that included an additional epilogue scenario called Future Connected to focus on the character Melia. This epilogue served as a bit of a tie-in for the events that take place in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which was released on the Nintendo Switch in 2022. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was a crazy game in several ways. The first was that the game could have a rare and staggering 6-character active party in battle, something I hadn't really seen in a big-budget JRPG since the early Suikoden games. The game inherited elements from how characters in Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 charge their arts after use, which actually ties in beautifully with the game's story. The other way this game was crazy is in how dark it was. The villains were twisted, and unlike the most mostly happy settings of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. This game took place in a world stuck in perpetual war, with killing and death being a common occurrence. In addition to the game's 6 main characters, a 7th hero character controlled by AI can be in the party too, covering a weakness in job coverage or just serving to emphasize a strength. Managing 6 or 7 characters in battle is, as you can imagine, a challenge, but there's a bigger emphasis on strategy over tactics in how your party is placed on the field and how their classes are distributed to contribute to the party. Speaking of classes, there are a lot of them, and they are mostly learned from the various heroes you can do quests for and recruit into your party throughout the game. Each class has its own arts and special features in combat, but they fit into the role of attackers, healers, and defenders to help people keep track of their duties in combat. Xenoblade Chronicles 3's battle system is also complex, but the game introduces its complexity over time so players can get good enough at the game to take advantage of the mechanics. The game wasn't too difficult for me on hard, but I tend to favor these kinds of strategic big picture battle systems versus managing the minutiae. Arts can be interlinked, chain attacks are back from previous games, and a new feature lets you fuse your party members into a powerful form. Similar to the other numbered Xenoblade titles, this game's world is a series of connected open zones for players to experience a linear story with lots of things to discover through exploration and side quests to do in between. Masatsugu Saito returned as the character designer for this game, and Yasunori Mitsuda returned with the team from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 for the game's soundtrack, which prominently featured the flute for this game in particular for story reasons. Similar to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, an expansion pass with an additional story scenario called Future Redeemed was released with the game. The DLC remixed the combat from the original game and included some very nostalgic content for people who played the first 2 Xenoblade Chronicles games. The DLC was so good that a lot of players liked it even more than the base game, as great as it was. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 reviewed very well and was nominated for numerous awards at multiple Game Awards shows, including Game of the Year at the Game Awards 2022. The game sold 112,728 copies in Japan in its first week of sales. The game was the UK's best launch for a Xenoblade title as far as sales went. Worldwide as of March 2023, the game has sold 1.86 million copies. And that brings us to the newest Xenoblade game that will be released on March 20, 2025. Xenoblade Chronicles Cross Definitive Edition, an updated version of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross with additional story content to address the rather abrupt ending of the main story in the original Wii U game. In addition to more story and an additional place to explore, the game is adding some new characters to join your party and a new scout to customize and use in battle. There are some new mixes of Hiroyuki Sawano's incredible soundtrack added to the game too. Now, I mentioned in a previous video after the game's first announcement that Xenoblade Chronicles Cross Definitive Edition would have to add more content to get me on board, and that's exactly what Monolith Soft did, so I will be purchasing this game. While I basically forgot the story to Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, that really just gives me all the more reason to play it again, and even if the story doesn't hook me, I already know the gameplay will because it already has on the Wii U. The Xeno series has gone through an incredible transformation since Xenogears. Whereas Xenogears was influenced by psychology, philosophy, and some dark science fiction, the games in Xenoblade Chronicles series have broader influences. Like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was said to be influenced by stories like Leiji Matsumoto's Galaxy Express 999 with the boy protagonist and the regal woman, which at one time was as popular as Gundam. I still think Xenogears was where the series peaked at story, and I don't see Monolith Soft topping this unless Nintendo allows them to create a mature rated game, which is something Tetsuya Takahashi did express interest in. The Xenosaga series really doesn't exist too much to me, since my inability to enjoy the first game more or less gatekeeps me from the rest of the series, but I did follow Tetsuya Takahashi and kept a close eye on what Monolith Soft was doing over the years. I liked Baten Kaitos, but it wasn't that amazing and I didn't even like it enough to want to play the second game. Somobringer was a cool action RPG, but nothing too special compared to other games I played on the 3DS. It wasn't really until I bought the Wii, just to play Xenoblade Chronicles, that I felt Tetsuya Takahashi finally made another good Xeno game. Sure, the story was watered down in its depth compared to Xenogears, but the open world gameplay and battle system were fun, which was all I needed. The story was also really good too, just that after Xenogears, I was kind of spoiled. The game was amazing compared to the other big JRPG at the time, Final Fantasy XIII, which I also bought a game system to play, the PlayStation 3, and then I was disappointed with how the game was extremely linear with little to no exploration. In fact, in many ways, Final Fantasy XIII feels like the exact opposite of what Xenoblade Chronicles was with its connected large open zones. I do think Xenoblade Chronicles was a bit overrated when it came west, but I think that's partially because the excitement for the game reached an explosive peak before Nintendo brought the game to North America. And if Nintendo is good at anything, it's turning public excitement for an upcoming game into great word of mouth when the game finally launches. Anyways, Xenoblade Chronicles had a lot of potential in its design for future entries, which was why I was really excited when Monolith Soft announced Xenoblade Chronicles Cross with its true open world. Xenoblade Chronicles Cross was more my style of JRPG. There are just so many viable and different ways to play the game among all the different different weapon classes, skills, and ways to focus what you get the most experience from. Whether it's building my character to do stupid silly amounts of one-hit KO damage to tyrants with a sniper rifle, or role-playing a Jedi Knight with a lightsaber, or grinding weapons so my skells could take advantage of their natural strengths to their peak. This is how the game managed to keep me entertained for 700 hours when most of the best JRPGs I've played have only managed to keep me entertained for maybe 60 to 100 hours max. The connected multiplayer elements are a lot of fun too. I don't like MMOs, but the way this game does multiplayer really jived with me too. And I could go on forever about Sawano's soundtrack for this game. I remember just idling in Sylvalum to enjoy the day and night themes, or spending a little more time in New LA at night just to get to the good part of the New LA theme. Some big criticisms of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross that I can understand were in the lack of emotion of the characters' faces expressed. Not in the Mass Effect 3 sense, where the characters attempted facial expressions and failed terribly and were memed hard, but more like the characters never really changed facial expressions. The lack of facial expressions made sense to me after a certain point of the game's story, but it did bother a lot of people. This criticism may have prompted Tetsuya Takahashi to go full anime for extra expressiveness in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which I approve of, even if the facial expressions in Xenoblade Chronicles Cross didn't bother me personally. There were also some criticisms of the game's soundtrack too, probably from people expecting the return of Xenoblade Chronicles' sound. As awesome as this music was, a lot of Sawano's tracks were too long for the scenes they played in, and even the combat tracks rarely reached their looping points because fights would end too quickly. The low amount of main story content was the last big complaint I remember. Oh, and there was a group of people unhappy that content was cut from the Japanese version of the game of one of the characters in a bathing suit too. When Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was on the radar, I was on board day one. The game's anime aesthetics were appealing. The characters were a lot more expressive than in the past Xenoblade games, and I loved the eccentric variety of blade designs in the game. The game did have some technical issues, and the main character didn't appeal to me at first, but the two most boring characters in the game, Nia and Rex, became awesome by the end of the game. And Rex became even more awesome in another later Xenoblade game too. In fact, he's probably my favorite Xenoblade character now. When a game can make a character I think is boring that awesome, you know it's doing something right. I did everything in that game and it took me over 300 hours. Probably the only part of that 300 hours I hated was everything involving grinding the blade Ursula's affinity just to see her events. Xenoblade Chronicles 2's expansion pass content was a lot of fun too. This game's biggest criticism was its performance at launch on the Switch. Monolith Soft and Nintendo wanted this game out before the end of the Switch's launch year, and they probably had to make some performance concessions to accomplish that. Still, this game is easily my favorite numbered Xenoblade game, even if I think Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has better gameplay. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, to me, was 2 steps forward in gameplay and 1 step back in character design. It's not that the character design was bad. In fact, I hope Masatsugu Saito stays involved with the Xenoblade series. It's just that a world stuck in perpetual war doesn't leave much room for the kinds of fun character designs that were in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. My favorite characters in the game were actually the heroes, who were more like the blades in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 than the main characters in the actual game. All that said, I had a blast playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 on its hard difficulty. There's a lot going on to monitor, and using the special powers at the best time requires monitoring a lot of factors, like when a powerful monster is going to hit its rage mode, or whether the monster's health is low enough for me to kill it by popping off a chain attack. Setting up your party to work well together is extremely important too, since most of their actions are going to be automated. Doing combat in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 almost feels more like playing a real-time strategy game than a JRPG. This story has a really crazy twist closer to the end of the game too. Not as crazy as what I experienced in Xenogears, but it was also a very different kind of twist too. If you've played through Xenoblade Chronicles 3, you know exactly what part I'm talking about. This game was a tighter gameplay experience compared to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, so I was able to do everything in 217 hours of quality time, which is still extremely respectable playtime for JRPG standards. The game's expansion pass content is so good, it's probably the best DLC I've ever purchased for a game. So yeah, I think most of the modern Xeno games do at least one thing really well and everything else good enough to make them great games. I feel like Xenosaga had to stumble before Xenoblade Chronicles could succeed, and it's obvious Tetsuya Takahashi takes the criticisms of his games to heart with how he improves aspects of the games between releases. Partnering with Nintendo for Xenoblade Chronicles has only been good for his games. Using all that data and experience Nintendo has accumulated over the years with their blockbuster titles really refined the Xenoblade Chronicles series. And with the entire Xenoblade series now available on the Switch, it's clear that despite the series not reaching the sales numbers of Mario or Zelda, Nintendo does take the Xenoblade Chronicles franchise seriously. Especially when you consider their other franchises like Animal Crossing only have 1 game on each new console they produce. In general, the Xenoblade Chronicles games are some of the best modern JRPGs out now. They're most of the reason I end up buying new Nintendo consoles, at least. I'm glad Xenoblade Chronicles Cross is getting another chance on the Switch, but what I'm really looking forward to is what Tetsuya Takahashi is cooking up for the next Xeno game. Whether it's a continuation of the numbered series, a brand new Xeno series, or a new game in the vein of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, I'll probably be excited for it. The games do sell really well, but I still think it's a series set to explode in sales numbers one of these days with the right new entry. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.